Hello, welcome to Chapter 19. Okay, here are the highlights of Chapter 19 that we won't talk about like usual. I will say, however, Chapter 19 is like two different chapters, one on domestic policy and then one on foreign policy. A not so seamless transition between the two. Okay, the first part is about the electoral stability. Essentially, what they are talking about is the differences, and I think the difference between Democrats and Republicans in particular. I think we've already mentioned this before. There's a lot of big issues at that time that there's not really much difference between the Democrats and Republicans. However, if we look at the cultural basis of party identification, this is probably the easiest way to think about it. So when you think about Democrats, you should think Democrats typically are immigrants, poor, in the city, Catholic, and in the South. Just remember the Civil War and who was in charge of the South when the Civil War started. Republicans tend to be rich, more native-born Americans, suburbs, Protestants, African Americans, again, for the ones that could vote, and centered in New England. Again, this is not every single one, but just kind of a general description if you had to stereotype that. The Civil War pension system, this was one of the issues that was disputed. The Union soldiers were getting pensions, both black and white. But eventually that kind of faded away. Okay, here's a picture of the State, War, and Navy buildings. Okay, when it comes to patronage, and again, patronage is getting jobs. So kind of one of the incentives to campaign and support people is that you would get a job. Stalwarts, important term, stalwarts are Republicans that want to keep things the same. Okay, they understand that patronage is the lifeblood of the political party, so they don't want to change anything. Half-breeds are Republicans that want to introduce some reforms. So just think about halfway reforms of sorts. There you get the half-breeds. President Garfield was a half-breed, and so he actually got elected. He got elected and started implementing a few of his reforms, nothing really too crazy. And then what happens is he gets assassinated by a patronage seeker. Also kind of crazy, but a patronage seeker, Charles Guiteau. Okay, and Charles Guiteau, if you can read his thing, In Office or Your Life, probably not the best way to get a job, but shooting the person that could help you get a job. But so Garfield's assassinated, his vice president, Chester Arthur, takes over, and one of the changes he makes is the Pendleton Act. Pendleton Act creates a civil service exam for certain civil service jobs. Not a whole bunch at that time, but it is a start. So now people working in the government aren't necessarily or won't be there because of patronage, but they might actually be qualified. So that's a big change. Okay, Cleveland, Harrison, and the tariff. Tariff is another big issue. Remember, the tariff has actually been an issue since all the way back since the Tariff of Abominations, right? So you have Cleveland, who's a Democrat, Harrison, who is a Republican. They're squaring off. Actually, before them, Cleveland is elected first. And Cleveland, when he's elected, he's running against James Blaine from Maine. And because they didn't differ much on the tariff stance, this is a lot of mudslinging. Cleveland had fathered a child out of wedlock. The chants were, "Mama, where's my pa? Off to the White House, ha, ha, ha." James Blaine, the chant against him was, "Blaine, Blaine, the continental liar from the state of Maine." So Cleveland actually wins that election. He gets into office. Raises some tariffs. Raised some tariffs, but actually has help from a priest or not priest, a religious leader who criticized the Democratic Party as the party of Romanism, and rebellion. Blaine is slow to criticize and thereby handing it to Cleveland. Harrison comes up later in 1884. He actually runs on the issue of raising tariffs, and so he raises the tariffs. And now we actually have an issue where they both differ. Harrison wins it, and then consequently Cleveland wins it back. So you have a lot of back and forth there. The new public issues, the Sherman antitrust is a big one. This is a response again to the monopoly power, growing monopoly power. Okay, states had tried to limit the power of trusts and monopolies. That didn't work, so they looked to the federal government. The federal government actually passed one. However, this was ineffective. Okay, you should note that, ineffective. actually before 1900 they used the Sherman Antitrust Act against unions because they said that got in the way of business. Okay, McKinley raises the tariff, which promptly costs the Republicans a lot of seats in the Congress. Skipping down here, the Interstate Commerce Act. Interstate Commerce Act is again dealing with one of the big issues of the day, railroad rates. Okay, so railroads are gouging farmers. The Interstate Commerce Act creates the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. Okay, and what you should remember for the ICC, it is essentially toothless. The act says that railroads cannot discriminate between long haul and short hauls. They have to publish their rates. They have to have reasonable rates. But because the ICC was really powerless to do anything, it would be up to the courts, and the courts did not support that. It really didn't get much accomplished. Okay, so the big one of the groups that was harmed a lot during the Gilded Age, if you remember, was the farmers. Okay, so the Grange, and that's a term you should know. So the Grange, essentially, they start off as farmers that are getting together to share new farming techniques. They're trying to build a community of farmers because remember, it's pretty isolated out there in some places. They evolve a little bit into a co-op, so they share purchasing power, so they'll get together and buy bags in bulk. They'll buy twine in bulk. Okay, it's kind of like when your mom goes to Costco and she buys the bathroom tissue in bulk, and that takes up the guest room now. Okay, that's their origins. Their economic grievances was against, again, the railroads, and so they actually had one control. This gets in the political program. They won control of some state legislators, and they actually got state laws passed regulating railroad rates. Okay, one of those was tested. The court case was Munn versus Illinois. That's probably a court case you should know. Munn versus Illinois. However, that was overturned by these Wabash cases, a series of cases that the Supreme Court said that only the federal government can regulate railroad rates because it is it's interstate commerce. Okay, so the Grange evolves into the Farmers Alliance, and the Farmers Alliance is essentially like the Grange. The only difference is the Farmers Alliance is more widespread. Okay, Mary Lease is one of the prominent spokespeople for the Farmers Alliance. They accept women equally. And Mary Lease's famous quote that I love is, "We need to spend time raising less corn and more hell." And that's kind of the approach. So same thing, they won control of some state legislators. They actually won some governor's position, but not enough. Okay, and that's where you get the People's Party, also known as the Populist Party. And so the best way to think about this is the Grange starts off as kind of like a caterpillar down here. And then the Farmers Alliance becomes kind of like this chrysalis. And then the People's Party, the Populist Party, is kind of like the full evolution of that. Okay, so we go from caterpillar to chrysalis to butterfly. Okay, and we'll get back to the Populist Party in a sec. So the Populist constituency, they included silver miners out west. Okay, free silver. Silver miners had a hard time, and then it will come up, and this is kind of Brinkley doing a disjointed, but they want to attract free silver. So they also want to attract color or farmers down south, African American farmers, tenant farmers, sharecroppers. That gets a little bit tricky now because if to attract them, the whites in the South wanted to make sure that it was understood they were still going to be on top. Okay, that it doesn't mean blacks were going to be equal, but they, they wanted a part of the support, and that was actually used against them. Okay, populist idea. So the populist platform. Listen carefully. This is important. The populist platform. Again, they're trying to attract a wide base of support. So for farmers, they first and foremost, to attract the farmers, they said the government should start a sub-treasury plan. Sub-treasury plan is where the government would build warehouses, farmers could store their crops there, and in the meantime, the government would loan farmers money, so they wouldn't have to go to the banks, loan farmers money. And then when crop prices went up, they could sell their crops, and pay the government back. They also suggested an 8-hour workday, okay, as the way to attract workers and laborers. So actually, some of the former Knights of Labor folks went to the Populist Party. To attract silver, they wanted the unlimited coinage of silver. They said there should be direct election of senators. They said the government should own utilities and the railroads. Again, so the Populist Party is trying to attract the widest base of support as possible. Their big challenge is they're trying to change this belief that laissez-faire is the best way to go. Again, laissez-faire is government being hands off. Okay, the Panic of 1893. It started by the Philadelphia and Reading Railroads going bankrupt, and then the Cordage Company goes bankrupt, and essentially what happens, this triggers um, bank failures throughout the economy. Okay, and with bank failures throughout the economy, there's no credit. And the big takeaway from the 1893 election, one is the economy is now interconnected. Okay, so just because one part is doing bad, or because one part is doing bad, that could topple down or domino into your particular industry. Second thing from the Panic of 1893, it triggers this Coxey's Army. This is kind of important here. Coxey's Army, Jacob Coxey was an unemployed businessman from Massillon, Ohio. He was going to march to Washington. Okay, and he accumulates all these supporters going to Washington. You can see in the picture on the right, not much of an army, but anyways, a group of people coming. Coxey's actually arrested in Washington. His supporters are shuffled off to some tent city. The big takeaway from Coxey's Army, it looks like a point of instability. And you got to keep in mind, this is the same time that the Pullman strike and Homestead strike are going on. And for the middle class, and so from the middle class viewpoint, it looks like there's a lot of social instability, which there kind of is. Okay, the silver question. Again, the miners in the West are mining silver. Okay, and the government used to use silver as a 16-to-1 ratio for gold. But people weren't selling it to the government because you could actually get more money selling it to people that were making jewelry or whatever else out of silver. And then what happens is the price of silver drops, and they're not getting that. And so the government in the crime of 73 had demonetized silver. So they are not using silver anymore. And now all the silver miners are pissed. Okay, and so they want the government to start buying it. Okay, and so what this becomes is a kind of a touchstone here. Symbolic importance, the currency question. People that are gold supporters typically are rich, they're creditors. Okay, bankers, if you want to think about it that way. People that are silver supporters typically are farmers. They want government expansion of the money supply. People that tend to be in debt. Okay, so when we talk gold and silver, those are kind of like code words for things. Kind of like when you say, I support Michigan or I support Ohio State. We know what you really mean. Okay, so what we get is the emergence of William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, at 36, becomes the youngest nominee for president. And so they're in the Democratic Convention. This is William Jennings Bryan right here. Democratic Convention, there's a lot of debate whether they should have a silver platform in their convention. William Jennings Bryan goes up to the stage and he gives this famous Cross of Gold speech. And Cross of Gold speech is, do not press upon this crown of thorns upon the brow of labor and crucify us upon this cross of gold. A lot of obviously religious imagery there. He gets nominated by the Democrats. And for the populists, they're like, oh crap. They were going to, because the Democrats now support the silver question, that kind of undermines part of their platform. So should they get together with the Democrats, or should they go on their own? If they go on their own, that's going to potentially spell trouble and split the votes. So they go ahead and nominate William Jennings Bryan also. So he's nominated by the Democrats and the Populist Party, although they have separate vice presidential nominees. And so this is the big election, the 1896 election. 1896 election, it is William Jennings Bryan versus William McKinley. Okay, William Jennings Bryan, again, Democratic Party and Populist Party. William McKinley is the Republican Party. And the modern campaigning is William Jennings Bryan. He goes on a cross-country tour giving speeches. He's a great speaker. Talks to thousands of people. William McKinley is not a great speaker, so you don't take somebody on in their strength. William McKinley sits home, and they call it the front porch campaign. They bring people in by the trainload. William McKinley gives them a speech regarding whatever issue they're concerned about, and then they put them on the train and send them back out and bring somebody else in. And how are they able to do this? This campaign, William McKinley's campaign, gets millions of dollars. I believe it's $7 million from businesses, because businesses are really worried if William Jennings Bryan becomes president, they're going to be in trouble. So his campaign manager Marcus Hanna, McKinley's campaign manager Marcus Hanna, gets millions of dollars in donation from businesses, and McKinley wins. Okay, part of his reason for his win, not all farmers are the same. So farmers on the East Coast are actually doing pretty good, and labor tends to vote for McKinley, contrary to what people might think. McKinley had been pretty square with labor when he was, I believe, the Ohio governor, and so they end up voting for McKinley. That is the end of the Populist Party. Populist Party is around for 2 election cycles only, 1892 and 1896, and then they're done. Okay, and after that, things start to get better. Currency Act sets, I don't know why Brinkley highlights this, sets the ratio of how much gold to each dollar. Here's a map. Okay, not so subtle transition to imperialism. So imperialism, instead of all this, you're going to pay attention closely, and here are the reasons for imperialism. One, you need resources. Okay, so as a country, for a country to continue to grow, including the United States, we need resources. Two, kind of what the political cartoon here implies, that we're in a global competition. So even if we want to take the moral high ground and not practice imperialism, we got to compete against other countries. So Germany and Great Britain and Russia are all imperialist powers. Okay, so if we stay out of it, we're going to be left out. Okay, that's two. Reason number three is we need markets. Again, by 1900, U.S. had become the leading economy in the world and the leading exporter in the world. And so as we continually make more things, we have to have markets, new markets to sell those things. Okay, number four, military. This is where Alfred T. Mann, I always want to say Mahan, it's we'll call him Mann for now. So he has an influential book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And his argument is we need a strong Navy because a strong Navy in times of peace will help us trade, and in times of war will help us defend ourselves. And so if we're going to have a strong Navy, we need places around the world to refuel. So that's argument number four. Argument number five, and this is kind of this one, intellectual justification. Argument number five can be summed up really in white man's burden, the argument of white man's burden. And so Brinkley doesn't use the term for some reason, but white man's burden is this idea that whites are superior, and consequently democracy is the best form of government and capitalism is the best form of best economic program. And so we have a responsibility to spread that to the rest of the world. Okay, where do you begin to see this? Venezuelan, we're not imperialists yet, that's the key. Venezuelan dispute, Great Britain is an argument with Venezuela. If you remember the Monroe Doctrine, nobody's supposed to be over here, and we threaten war, and eventually get that settled up. So probably not that important. Okay, Hawaii here in the 1890s. Okay, Hawaii was a self-sufficient society, so a lot of groups there with their own chieftains, pretty much self-sufficient. And what you get then is you get American planters coming in. They start growing sugar. A little bit later, they start growing pineapples. And to avoid tariffs, because now there's a sugar tariff on importing sugar to the United States from Hawaii, they want to turn Hawaii into an American territory. So Queen Liliuokalani, she has a Hawaii for Hawaiians movement and wants to kick the Americans off the land and restore Hawaii for Hawaiians. They have an overthrow. This Marine station off the coast of Hawaii, there's an overthrow the Queen. They take charge. They want the United States to annex them. Initially, the United States is hesitant, especially President Cleveland, because of the way things happen, but it's too late to kind of go back. So eventually Hawaii does become American property. Samoa is another example. Samoa, an island in the Pacific. We are jockeying with Great Britain and Germany to win control of Samoa. Eventually, U.S. and Germany decide to split it, and Great Britain gets some territory elsewhere in the Pacific. Okay, this is the turning point for where America becomes imperialist. Okay, we participate in the Spanish-American War, and so the background to this, the Cubans have revolting. Cuba and Puerto Rico are one of the remaining territories of Spain from Spain's heyday as a imperialist power. So Cubans have been revolting on and off. They are revolting again. The difference this time is that there's now yellow journalists. Yellow journalists are newspapers that publish these exaggerated stories. And so what happens, Joseph Pulitzer in the New York World and William Randolph Hearst in the New York Journal, they published these scandalous stories of Spanish brutalities, and the poor Cubans are being brutalized by Spain, and it's working Americans up into a fervor to join the war. The Maine explodes, and so we send a warship to Havana Harbor to protect American lives, and then you get the explosion of the Maine, and you get pictures like this that shows like guys like exploding up into the air. Um, when they investigate, they blame it on the Spanish, even though later they find out, much later they find out it wasn't actually probably an internal explosion. Um, in addition to that, there's the Delome letter. The Delome letter is a letter from the Spanish minister in the United States that gets intercepted and published. And in that letter, Delome is criticizing William McKinley, saying the Spanish don't have to worry about him because he's weak and he just wants attention. Once that gets out, Americans are angry. Okay, it's one thing for you to criticize your own president. Only another thing to have somebody else, some other country, criticize your president. So we get involved in the Spanish-American War. It is a splendid little war. Why is it a splendid little war? It lasts 4 months. 460 Americans are killed in battle, as compared to 5,200 that die of disease. Okay, so that tells you what kind of war it is. One of the important parts about the Spanish-American War is Commodore Dewey actually goes to the Philippines, and he sails into Manila Harbor, and defeats the Spanish fleet that's trapped in Manila Harbor. Okay, the battle for Cuba with Rough Riders has more lore than anything. Really not that important of a battle, but we get a new hero. We get our new war hero, Teddy Roosevelt, who was actually Assistant Secretary of the Navy, resigned so he can participate in the war. Okay, so after the war, the Treaty of Paris, a couple important things. We get the Philippines and we get Puerto Rico. And there's a big debate about Puerto Rico and what should happen with Puerto Rico. Eventually, we settle on this idea that we establish a colonial government under the Four-Acre Act. Okay, so Puerto Rico is now U.S. territory. It's a booming sugar economy. Okay, War with Spain, there's a map. The big problem now is what should we do with the Philippines? Okay, and so here's the debate. So on one side we have the imperialists, okay, and we went over those arguments in the beginning. Why imperialism, markets, military, a white man's burden, resources, competition. The anti-imperialist league, though, has their own arguments, and their arguments are several. So one is a racist argument that, hey, we already have race issues in this country, obviously with African Americans and Native Americans. Why would we want to have more territories with more quote unquote brown people? The second argument against imperialism is from labor's viewpoint. So labor argued that you conquer these territories, you're going to bring in cheaper labor, and that's just going to depress wages, so that's a bad thing. Third argument is it's anti-democratic. Again, we are founded on this belief that all men are created equal. You have a say in your government. If we become imperialists, obviously that won't be true. Last argument is it's just immoral. Okay, that it is wrong to control people without their consent. Okay, and one of the questions at that time was, does the Constitution follow the flag? Okay, so we do have the Philippines. Are those people protected by the Constitution? Okay, and the answer back then was no. Okay, we get election of 1900. McKinley's reelected, and things look like they're going to be pretty good until he gets assassinated. Okay, so governing the colonies, the Platt Amendment refers to Cuba. Okay, and so we're going to be the good guys and just help Cuba out because we're good guys, but it turns out it's a little bit more than that. So Platt Amendment essentially tells Cuba that they cannot enter any treaties that would threaten their independence. We have the right to intervene anytime we want, and we have the right to have a naval base in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay. Okay, and so the Platt Amendment is part of the Cuban Constitution, but we force them. I like to think about it kind of being like the bad ex-boyfriend that they can, you can't date anybody else, and they can park in your driveway whenever they want and essentially can't get rid of them. Okay, back to the Philippines. What we have is the Filipinos aren't so keen on America having control over the Philippines. They were actually rebelling against the Spanish when the U.S. came in and we helped them, and they thought we're going to let them become independent. That turned out not to be true. We actually had to put down a rebellion against them. And so Emilio Aguinaldo is who leads the Filipino insurrection. And it lasts several years. There are more Americans, almost 10 times as Americans die in the Filipino insurrection than in the actual Spanish-American War. Okay, eventually it's subjugated, under control, and they become dependent on U.S. trade. Okay, so it's like imperialism kind of without the total control. Okay, it's economic imperialism. Okay, in this insurrection, just as a quick side note, there's a lot of guerrilla warfare. The U.S. actually ends up doing what the Spanish were doing in Cuba. They have these concentration camps where they burn down the villages, they torture individuals, they just casually kill Filipinos, and just as as a kind of precursor to other wars, like particularly like the Vietnam War, which will run into a similar situation. Okay, it's not until 1946 do the Cubans become independent. Okay, here's a map, pictures of Filipino prisoners. The last bit here, the open door notes. Open door is competition in China, as you can see from the political cartoon. Open doors in China, and Secretary of State Hay issues these open door notes to other competing powers. Okay, to Germany, to Great Britain, to Russia, and to Japan. You cannot carve up China into spheres. It has to remain, quote unquote, an open door. Not all the powers agreed. Actually, very few of them agreed. Some of them just kind of brushed it off. And Hayes' stroke of genius was, okay, now that he stated, now that we all agree on the open doors policy, that's going to take place. The one country they didn't ask was the Chinese and how they felt about it. And so you have a Boxer rebellion in China. The Boxer Society is a secret society of martial artists that believe they can't be killed by bullets. The U.S. and other Western powers actually have to go in there and put down the rebellion and kind of force China to remain an open door. Okay, the military reforms we're not going to really concern ourselves with because that doesn't really show up on the AP test. So, hope you have enjoyed the quick version of Chapter 19, and I think I'm supposed to ask you to subscribe to the channel at this point to, I don't know, make sure you get updates or something. So, see you back in class.